What was the program that Reagan nearly implemented or began to implement?
Oh, that was, this is very important, because in the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, we had the strategic crisis, the so-called middle range missile crisis. This was the period when the SS-20 and the Pershing 21 were launch on warning all the time and only 5 minutes or so in between. So if, a mistake would have happened, some error in reading the screen, or, we were all the time 5 minutes away from World War III. So at that time, my husband, because we had a magazine at the time, a scientific magazine, which was called Fusion Magazine, which had 150,000 subscriptions for a scientific magazine. This is quite big. And in that capacity, we monitored all scientific breakthroughs, developments, and so forth. And we noticed that the Russians were quite intensively studying on new weapon systems. So my husband said the biggest danger comes when one superpower is able to implement superior weapons based on new physical principles, because that means the temptation for the other superpower to use these weapons while you still can. So, and that was an opinion which was shared by many military experts at the time. So he designed this program whereby the United States and the Soviet Union would have jointly developed these new weapon systems and implemented them together. And President Reagan offered that. He said, look, my husband said that the Soviets had a disadvantage by using modern technologies in the civilian area. They were extremely efficient in the military area. They had even secret science cities, but they could not implement these technologies in the civilian area. For example, they lost up to 40% of the agricultural product as a result. So the proposal was that the West would help, that both superpowers would develop these systems together, and the West would help the Soviet Union to implement them in the civilian economy, solving a big bottleneck for them. But then both would start to make nuclear weapons obsolete, because these were weapon systems based on laser technology and similar new principles, which the Soviets and the Russians now in part have developed in the meantime alone. And that way, you could have injected these new technologies in the civilian economy, and that would have been an incredible science booster, a science motor, and then use the increased product for a huge technology transfer to the developing countries in order to overcome the underdevelopment. It would have meant that, basically both would have worked together to eliminate poverty in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and eventually even dissolve the blocs, dissolve NATO, dissolve the Warsaw Pact. Now that was an absolute visionary idea. And we made conferences about that in Rome, in Paris, in Bonn, in Washington. And out of that came actually a process of dialogue with the Soviets. And for 1 year, we had so-called back-channel discussions about the feasibility of such a proposal. And then only in February 1983, the answer came back from Moscow. No, we don't like that because it would bring more advantages to the West. But Reagan went ahead, and 1 month later, on the 23rd of March, he said, this is American policy. And he offered the same offer to the Soviets, and he repeated that 8 months later. So, in a certain sense, we would not be in the kind of war danger we are presently right now if this idea would have been pursued, because, it would have meant it would have actually meant the end of geopolitics, that you stop treating the other country as an enemy by definition, and that you would have looked for common grounds, or as Edward Teller said it at the time, the common aims of mankind. And, I think we are today more than ever at the point where either we agree on what are the common aims of mankind, or we are in acute danger of leading to our own annihilation as a species.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're inching closer and closer to that the second option there I mean, just the warmongering has really ramped up, especially here in the United States. The chatter now, obviously, Russia has remained the big bad enemy of the United States. Um, Even when it makes no real sense, Russia is still the enemy of the United States. And now the United States is even looking at China and trying to maybe pick fights with China, which I don't think they're going to be successful in because there's just too much business entanglement there. I don't think that the business class of the United States is going to tolerate any real war with China. There's just way too much entanglement there. So I think the politicians can talk all they want. When it comes to Russia, you're in a unique position because you're over there in Germany, and you've been in Germany your whole life. You were born there, obviously, and
Yeah,
um,
but while I was married to LaRouche, who unfortunately passed away 5 years ago, I spent about half of the time in the United States and half in Germany.
so from your perspective in Germany, Germany's in a unique situation when it comes to Russia, and probably has a better vantage point of what really is the threat or no threat with Russia. What in your viewpoint, uh, what is Russia a threat, first of all?
But even if that is the opposite of what the mainstream media are saying, I don't think that Russia would be a threat if the West would show any sign of willingness to go back to a normal diplomatic approach. Because, if you look at it, when the wall came down in Berlin in '89, the Soviets at that time were extremely generous. There were no tanks on the streets. There was a peaceful unification. There was actually the real chance for a peace order. A lot of people were talking about the common European house, not only Gorbachev, but many others. Jack Matlock, for example, was a key factor in the situation. So, it would have been very easy to take the fact that the Soviet Union was disintegrating as the beginning for a new peace order.
Yeah.
And, there was the promise not to expand NATO 1 inch to the east, which was definitely given. There are enough time witnesses who absolutely confirm that that was said. And we, meaning my husband and our movement, we proposed at that time the Eurasian land bridge. This was the idea to connect Europe and Asia through economic development corridors, and that way give an economic basis to a new peace order. Now that's led to the new Silk Road and the Belt and Road Initiative
Right.
today. So it was effective, but it was, basically rejected by the powers to be, by Bush, by Thatcher, by Mitterrand, who had all their own geopolitical reasons to contain Russia. There was a policy, the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which said that now that the United States is the winner of the Cold War, we will make sure that never again one country or a group of countries bypasses us in terms of economics, politics, culturally, militarily. So they, while on the one side the promise was made not to expand NATO, the neocons in the United States clearly had the design to consolidate an unipolar world order based on the Anglo-American special relationship. And they started to proceed to develop that. Now, Pope John Paul II, he at the time said, he was warning, he said, the fact that the Soviet Union disintegrated should not be misunderstood by the West, that the West won. Because if you look at especially the condition in the developing countries, there are structures of sin. The underdevelopment of the developing countries are the proof that there are structures of sin everywhere. not only in the East, but also in the West. So the rational approach would have been to go in the direction what we proposed, but we proposed the Eurasian land bridge to all countries of Eurasia, and the only country which responded was China. And in '96 they organized a big conference in Beijing called the development of the regions along the Eurasian land bridge, and they had the idea to make that the dominant policy already then. But then in '97 came the Asia crisis, all the currencies were speculated down. And then in '98 came the Russia AQO crisis, which was state bankruptcy de facto. So this was all slowed down. But then in 2013, Xi Jinping announced the new Silk Road in Kazakhstan. And for the last 10, almost 11 years, that has become a growing policy, now involving 150 countries. So it is definitely, it is efficient. It does help all the countries who participate to overcome poverty, which is why they all join. You wouldn't have 150 countries cooperating if it would not bring benefits for them. Unfortunately, the West, after some time, started the idea that the unipolar world had to be defended, with color revolutions, that countries who had governments, which did not go along with that you should change the regime. There were later the interventionist wars, always trying to, keep this unipolar order, which later was called the rules-based order. Now, that has slowly, step by step, and I think most people in the West have not really realized in a certain sense, the West was also cooked like a frog. The image when you put a frog into the pot and boil it, and if it's hot, the frog jumps out, but if you increase the temperature slowly, the frog gets cooked. So I think the Western people got also cooked by step agreeing that more an enemy image was developed, more of the idea that the rules-based order are the good ones and the other ones are the evil ones. And I think we are now at a very dangerous moment because you have a complete discrepancy. Prime Minister Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, just went to a summit in Brussels, EU summit, and he said this was incredible. This was like entering a different galaxy. What he meant was that the war mentality, the idea that you have to send more weapons, you have to have more confrontation, that has become such a paradigm shift, that somebody who doesn't think that way says it's a different galaxy. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a very dangerous situation because, when you are saying that we have to become war ready, that's what the German defense minister Pistorius said, and naturally the whole EU is saying nowadays, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we are right now at an extremely dangerous moment because it's clear the Ukraine war did not go the way people had planned it. And now NATO is de facto confronted, this was pointed out by former General Kuyat, who was the head of the NATO military command and he was the general inspector of the Bundeswehr. He said, already last August that NATO is now confronted with the choice to either escalate, and then we are in a very dangerous, we could have a NATO-Russia war, which could be the end of us all, or you go to diplomacy. And right now, diplomacy has almost become a dirty word. If you say, like the Pope is calling for a diplomatic solution, then people are attacking him, or the faction leader in Germany, Mützenich, he called for a freezing of the conflict to then eventually find a diplomatic way out. Everybody jumped on him and attacked him, and it's really like, it reminds you, if you study history, it reminds you so much of the period before World War One, where everybody became gang ho, let's have war, let's have war. Naturally, nobody anticipated how the First World War would go. That it was not finished quickly as people had expected, but it was 4 long weeks in the trenches of Verdun. Back and forth, back and forth. Many young people got killed, and the result of it was, you had a lost generation. You had, I think, 17 million people dead, and Germany derooted completely, completely derooted of every normal kind of thing. Naturally, then that led to World War II. And I'm afraid that if we don't stop this, that we are ending up in World War III.
It certainly feels that way, and it certainly feels like the world is operating on fear. Fear seems to be the driving force, but it's a greedy fear obviously for the military industrial complex, for the elites. It's a fear of losing their power, fear of losing their monetary gain over the world, and they're just fighting tooth and nail, it feels, to hold on to that power, to hold on to that unipolar world rather than allowing what should be a multipolar world to rise up. Hey guys, this was just a clip of a longer show. Catch the full show by going to KimIversonShow.com. It is free. It airs Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. You could go back now and watch this full interview. I highly recommend it. Again, go to KimIversonShow.com. Thank you so much for watching.